So, Zoe Blaskey, I am delighted to have you as one of our expert episodes. And I think probably most significantly, you're a mother of two, and you're a coach, and you're the founder of the MotherKind podcast, and you have just written this wonderful new book, MotherKind, A New Way to Thrive in a World of Endless Expectations. So I was wondering, what led you to write the book when you have so much in the podcast already? Why did you want to write a book?
I think I really wanted to put everything that I've learned. You know what it's like hosting a podcast. You just learn so much. And I found that I was spending a lot of my time pointing people to different episodes. And I thought, do you know what? I just wish there was one resource where I could condense everything across the past 7 years, where it was neatly organized into chapters and tools and ideas. And I could just put not only my story, but the experts that I've had on the podcast and my clients' stories in one place. And yeah, I've done that. And I feel super proud of it, and just so happy that now mothers or parents or anyone actually going through any challenges related to the pressures of modern parenting and modern motherhood can find, go to a chapter on guilt, go to a chapter on feeling exhausted, go to a chapter on matrescence, which is the kind of confusing feelings that come up when you become a mother. So yeah, I really wanted it to be a resource that someone could just dive into and get exactly what they need in that moment.
So is that the main intention with the book, is to support mothers and fathers, I guess? I mean, it's MotherKind, but I imagine you include all parents.
Yeah, I mean, predominantly mothers, simply because that's what I've been researching and speaking to for the past 7 years. That's my lived experience. And I always want to teach and come from my own experience. I think that's really important to me. And so, yeah, I would say definitely
more authentic. You want to be authentic.
Yeah, any parent would benefit from it. But I've really tried to speak to that experience of a woman entering into that new phase of her life of becoming a mother and what that can mean. And I think many of it is the same, but much of it is also different. I think the expectations are really different on mothers than they are on fathers. I think going through matrescence, which is this process of unraveling in a way, that it is different. So I've tried to talk to that.
It's not an unraveling, is it? It's the process of transition into motherhood, which brings with it kind of joys and positive expanding emotions. I mean, it's like adolescence, and adolescence can have great highs.
Exactly. Yeah.
And also great lows. It's a kind of confusing time, but it's not just bad, is it, matrescence? It's fertile and rich and all of that.
Yeah, exactly. And you're so right to compare it to adolescence. That's exactly what matrescence is. It's the equivalent, where your brain changes, your body changes, your relationships change, your hormones change, your values change, your identity changes. You find yourself thinking, who am I now? And the reason I use that word unraveling is because that's so many mothers tell me that it feels like that. And I think in a way, adolescence does do that as well. So much changes. And if you don't know the word, that's why I'm so passionate about getting the word out there. You go to the place which is where I ended up, which is you think, I must be doing this wrong. I must be not cut out for this. I must be failing at this, because it feels so different than how I thought it was going to feel, and how different than how I was told it was going to feel. So I think the moment we normalize that actually your relationship's going to change, it's actually really normal to find, if you've had a baby with a partner, to find it really challenging, that relationship in the early years. That's normal. That is part of this matrescence process. So is questioning your values, what matters to you now. And actually the part of your brain responsible for empathy and compassion gets bigger. So you do find yourself more interested in world events that you just maybe weren't that into before.
And blubbing at the news.
That's it. You find yourself
being able to watch it, or
crying at adverts. I remember watching these adverts, the ones that try and tug on your heartstring, and just sobbing and thinking, gosh, I am different. And of course, all the research that I've done, and it's all in the book, about what happens to your brain. That's why we go from thinking me to we. And it makes sense that why our brain changes in that way, because we are responsible for a we now, but it has far bigger ramifications in our lives.
So it's more than the brain, isn't it? Because it's the mind-body. So it's the mind and the body as one unit. Mm-hmm. So when you say about the brain, it's actually the neurotransmitters that sends different signals different information, and it affects your whole body.
That's
It
right.
affects, I mean, you're breastfeeding, if you're breastfeeding, but, your whole body kind of feels really dramatically changed. You look at yourself in the mirror and you kind of go, oh, and also, wow, but, it changes you.
Yeah, and I think that's why I speak a lot about being so anti this bounce back message, because I think it certainly used to come from a physical perspective, like, all the
Bikini body or whatever.
oh gosh, all the just ridiculous headlines that, particularly in the 90s and early noughties, were completely normal to shame a woman a couple of weeks after birth. There's a video where Victoria Beckham, Posh Spice as she was known then, she was 8 weeks postpartum and she was weighed on live TV to see if she'd lost the baby weight yet. That was completely normal, that kind of discourse. So it's no wonder that it's actually in our psyche that we have to bounce back physically. But I think now it's come to mean so much more. For me, it's come to mean, can we bounce back into our old social lives, which of course we're never going to, because our time has changed, our priorities changed, and our
Your
friendship changed.
sleep. I mean,
Yes, you're exhausted. Who wants to go out, clubbing like you may be used to, or even out for dinner when you're so exhausted? And I think this idea that we have a child and the idea is to bounce back into who we were before, I think is why so many mothers and parents more generally really struggle, because the truth is that you can't go back. You are changed. Like any heart expanding change, like Julia, you talk so much about grief so beautifully, it changes you. And
even if it's a change you want, but change is uncomfortable.
Exactly. And most mothers and parents that I know, I can't think of one, I don't know if you can, Julia, who's had a straightforward, either conception or birth or postpartum. Every single person I know has been through a huge challenge, whether it's losses or IVF or birth trauma or struggling postpartum. And those challenges, they do change you.
I think some people do have an okay time. I mean, the people who tend to go to a coach or talk to me are more likely to be suffering, right? So it's a biased cohort. But I think it definitely is a universal thing that it profoundly changes us. And I think there's something generationally very different, because I'm almost like two generations. So I had my children like 44 years ago. And I think what's interesting about your book is like, why now? What's happening now in 2024 with the increase of pressures and burnout that makes your book particularly relevant in comparison to mine, where there were like 3 books, I think. I mean, in one sense, I was innocent because there was no social media and no books, but I was also ignorant. So I did all the wrong things, because you kind of read a Miriam Stoffard book and a couple of other books, and
it's really changing as well, because I'd like your perspective on this actually, because when I first started MotherKind 8 years ago, people would say to me, so it's a parenting platform. And I'd say, no, it's not parenting. It's about the experience, the emotional experience that a woman goes through when she is in motherhood, around managing her own emotions, around managing her own anxieties, fears, joys, tensions within her work life, tensions within her identity. And no one really got it for years. I would be, Zoe, that it's a parenting podcast. Now that's really changing, and I'm really excited about that. But I think certainly, to your point, I think the focus has been for so long on the parenting and what we do to our children, with a complete lack of understanding about what's most important is actually how we are within ourselves. Because I know that if I'm stressed out and dysregulated and overwhelmed, all the best parenting scripts in the world aren't going to land.
No. So it's like, put your mask on with your oxygen first. It's like, if you can regulate yourself and take care of yourself and support yourself, then you're much more likely to be able to be the parent that you kind of hope to be.
Exactly.
But I think the big thing that you do talk about is this idea of perfectionism, which I think is magnified by social media, isn't it? By TikTok, by all the kind of tropes of perfect motherhood, all these kind of images of blissful mothers. And, parenting can be blissful. We don't want to kind of give it an entirely negative.
No, I love it. But being a parent, being a mother is hands down the best thing that I have ever, ever, ever done. Hands down. I absolutely adore it. And I wish that I'd known some of these tools earlier. I think it would have helped me lean into the joy and take the pressure off so much more. When I look back in my early years, how hard I was on myself. I have that real perfectionist mindset,
Tendency.
and I can see where that comes from. And I talk about, where that might come from in the book as well, and just understanding that a little bit for ourselves. But I think when you take that into parenthood, where I've never cared about anything more than my children. So of course, all of those qualities that where I am hard on myself, where my inner critic does get very loud, where I am very perfectionist, they all came out to play big time around my children. And that, I think, is what I wish I'd known earlier might happen, and have some more tools to support me with that. It would have made a really big difference to me.
Do you want to tell us some of the tools so people listening can have an idea of what might help if they've got what I call a shitty committee kind of screaming at them?
Yeah, I mean, the first thing to know is that your inner critic gets louder the more that you care about something. So if that's happening to you, it's probably a sign of just how much you care about your children, which is an incredible thing. So don't think that there's anything wrong with you, that you suddenly are really hard on yourself. It's actually a sign of how much you care, which is a good thing. I think the most important thing is to be able to know that that voice isn't true, and it's not telling you the truth, and it's actually really hard, particularly
Feelings
if you
and facts, what I talk about.
exactly
Separate feelings
to
and
separate the
facts.
two. And if you've been swimming in that critic for a while, it's almost like the fish who doesn't know it's in water. It can feel, people say to me, but it is true, I am crap, like I am not good enough. So one of the simplest things to do is just to start looking for evidence that the opposite is true, just to give you even like a whisper of space between that voice is how you start. It's like chipping away at it. And I talk about, and I know you talk about this too, Julia, about just chipping away with the 1%. We don't make these changes in one, there's not one tool, there's not one idea, there's not one podcast or one therapist or one coach. It's just choosing every single day to chip away at that voice a little bit. So when you hear something that says, you're crap, mom, you fed, the kids aren't eating vegetables again today, you can think to yourself, is that really true? Like, does that really make me a terrible mother? Or does that just make me a mother of toddlers who all toddlers struggle to, yeah, it's completely normal. And also, if I think about the past week, they have had some veg. So I'm doing okay. Learning to bring in that compassionate voice. And I also think what really helps me is this idea of good enough parenting, which is that, if I thought I just had to get everything right in order to be a good enough parent. And actually that's not true. And the research shows that often the way that children build resilience is by having, imperfect parents, having the missteps. It's Donald Winnicott's work, around the 30% that, actually 30%, if we can meet a child's needs 30% of the time, then that is enough to create that secure attachment, which we so want to be able to create. And so 3 out of 10 is really 10 out of 10. And it really helps me to remember that. And I think the other thing, that when we have that perfectionist mindset, we tend to focus a lot on what we haven't done, on what's going badly, on what we've missed or failed at. And that's part of negativity bias as well, that our brain does naturally. So it can be really powerful just to think at the end of the day, what did I do today? Okay, well, I got my child up, dressed, fed, I got them to school or nursery on time. I, did something at work, I've got some dinner ready. Everyone's going to eat, everyone's got clean clothes. They seem like tiny things, but actually if you add up everything that you do in the day and allow yourself even for a moment to focus there, it just redresses that balance and balances up those scales a little bit, just to chip away again at that perfectionist. What would you add? I know you're so good at this stuff.
No, I think you said a lot. I think the first step is awareness, that is being aware of what you're saying to yourself. And as you said, would you speak to anybody in that tone or in that way? You wouldn't speak to your worst enemy like that. So, jotting it down and then looking at it and saying, cripes, do I really want to be saying that to myself all day long? And is that going to give me the outcome that I want? Beating me with a stick, is that going to make me a better mum? Not so much. And I think you talk a lot about guilt, which is really interesting, and guilt comes up, and I think in every aspect of life. But I think guilt and perfectionism are horrible. Shame, guilt, and perfectionism are horrible kind of triplets, bedfellows. And I wanted to know what you were thinking about guilt as well, which I think is linked to the critical voice.
It is. It really is. And you're right. Those three often come as a package and can really, really destroy or
Toxic,
just undermine being able to just, like sometimes I think about those three as wearing a straitjacket and you're just going through your parenting or your motherhood, just not being able to wriggle free of it and constantly on yourself. And it's just being able to just put on a looser garment, and just breathe and just allow yourself to enjoy it a little bit,
to be human,
a little bit more. Yeah, exactly.
With all our imperfections and
exactly.
good things. Yeah.
Exactly. You really helped me actually with guilt, and you're quoted in the book talking about this because you said, we need to stop this idea that we don't need to get rid of guilt because actually there's productive guilt. And I think the moment that we can understand that there is productive guilt and there's unproductive guilt and learn to just tease those two apart, that is really how we get freedom from it. And I know it can feel like, oh my gosh, another thing to add to the mental load is to understand my guilt. But the thing is, we're already spending so much time stuck in that place. It really is worth a couple of minutes every day just to think about, hang on a minute, what's going on here? How can I unravel this emotional reaction that I'm in or this place that I'm stuck in? So good guilt is actually really productive. It's a sign that we're connected to our children. It's a sign that we have empathy.
Socially connected, yeah.
Exactly, which is why you say it's only psychopaths that feel no guilt, because they don't have that empathy. So good guilt is where we do something wrong that goes against our values. Like the other day, I bashed my little girl's head on the car seat and I felt guilty about that, rightfully so. If I'd felt no guilt, I'd be really worried about myself. I said sorry to her, kissed her head, said, God, mummy's so silly for doing that. And next time I'll put her head lower. That is good guilt. But having spoken to and, coached all these thousands of parents, I think that's about 20% of the guilt that most parents actually experience. The other 80%, I don't think is guilt at all. It's a combination of some of the things that we were talking about, particularly the inner critic. There's also tension. So I think whenever we make a choice, there's tension of the choice that we didn't make. So if we choose to go to work that morning, we wish that we could just clone ourselves and also be at home with our little one.
Every yes for something is a no to something else.
Exactly,
every decision.
But
yeah.
That's right. But I think so often we call that tension guilt. It's not. It's just tension, and it's just part of life. That, even outside parenthood, in life in general, there's always a tension. When you make one choice, you can't make the other, and therefore you feel tension about it. And I use this analogy, which is like pulling on a rope. And if you don't know how to drop that rope and just accept that tension, you will always feel pulled in a million directions. So I think that's a really powerful idea. A lot of parents tell me that really helps them, is just accepting that there's always going to be tension in parenthood. You're always going to wish that you could be in more places at once. You're going to wish that you could be at pickup and at that big meeting. You're going to wish that you could be with one child and also be with the other. And you have to make those hard choices about whose assembly to go to or something. So I think that's the first thing. The second thing is the critic, which we've spoken about. The third thing, which parents tell me really helps them, is standards. So we tend to internalize, often without knowing it, through our subconscious, these standards which are way unrealistic and too high about what a good mother or a good parent does. And until we unearth those and make the invisible visible, we tend to judge ourselves by those standards. And I have a really big one around cooking. And I was just feeling so guilty that I wasn't cooking enough from scratch. And I thought, where did this come from? This isn't my idea. Like, I never told myself that would be something that I would want to do. It's not a huge value of mine. It's not something that I place a lot of time on. And so the moment I understood that and thought, hang on, what feels reasonable for me given my current capacity and my setup and my children and my situation, what feels reasonable? Okay, I'm going to cook from scratch 3 times a week. And I don't feel guilt about it anymore, just because I made that intentional and conscious choice. Whereas before it was just floating around, making me feel guilty. So it's almost
waiting for somewhere to land.
Exactly. Can we grab these things, take a couple of minutes and think, what is really empowering actually, Julia, to do it? Like, what is my standard here? Not what my mum did, not what my mum-in-law tells me.
Or your best friend.
Not what my best friend, or that book, or that person on Instagram, or even my partner. If they're not going to contribute to the cooking, they don't get much to say about this. So what feels right for me? And that really, like, clients have told me, and people in my community tell me, that one idea clears so much guilt for them. And then the last one, you already mentioned it, is shame, which is when we go from thinking that a behavior is bad, like me not cooking from scratch every day is bad, to thinking that we're bad.
I am bad. There's something wrong with me.
I am bad. Exactly. So guilt is there's a behavior, shame is I am. And so many mothers will say to me, I feel like a terrible mother. And that's a sign that you're in shame. And it's hard to talk about.
And it grows in darkness, like toxins.
That's right.
Isn't it?
So I talk about in the book that, when you feel that, hopefully you've got a friend who you can trust, who is able to hear you, and you can say, I'm feeling like a really terrible mum because my little one still isn't potty trained yet, because they're going to nursery full time. And hopefully that person will be able to say to you something kind and compassionate and validating, or maybe a me too. And that is how you start to move out of the shame. And if you haven't got that person in your life, which a lot of people
Journaling might help.
Journaling, absolutely. Or I talk about just going out into nature. I really believe in the healing power of nature, and going out and telling like a beautiful tree, or it sounds a bit woo, but I think it's really beautiful. Really helps.
And take your shoes off. Doing it barefoot.
Take your shoes off, do it barefoot. Go and say, I feel like a terrible mother, and just try and sit in that silence and absorb the stillness and the compassion
and the
from nature.
Mm.
I think that can really help, because so many mothers, message me on social media and say, I've got no one that I trust, that I can talk to, who I don't think is going to shame me or tell me that I'm doing it wrong. I mean, that's heartbreaking. So that's heartbreaking. That's another journaling, as well, as you mentioned, can be incredibly powerful.
And I think from a kind of macro perspective, recognizing that this is complex, that we can't get all of these things right. We're juggling, and we're doing the best we can, and good enough, and keep it in the day. And in the end, I think it's something about the capacity to give love and be loving. And that is in acts, it is in changing their nappy and feeding them food, but also it's just enjoying the hug, so that, they feel loved. Because when they feel loved, they can actually build a lot of resilience a lot of imperfection. And don't underestimate the power of simply loving your child.
Yeah, so true. And I write about this in the book, because I think also a lot of what we call guilt is actually grief, of feeling guilty about how things were. And I talk about my relationship with my own mum, because she told me that she felt so much guilt.
It was lovely how you wrote about your mum. It's very moving. Amazing she gave you permission.
I mean, I said, do you want to read it? She said, no, I trust you. So,
wow.
Yeah.
So she doesn't regret that.
I know. I know. She's read it now. I did give her one last chance. So it's going to print next week. If you want me to change anything, read it. So, but I think because I paint it in such a positive light in so many ways.
She came through. Yeah.
That's right. And I know that she felt so guilty, and actually it was grief. She felt grief for not being able to be there for me in some of my life in the way that I know that she wanted to be. But I talk in the book how actually those moments that she feels guilty about actually mean that I'm sat here with you today, because I never would have got into therapy so young. I never would have found the passion for the work that I'm doing now. And it's not that I would ever want that to happen again. It's just that sometimes those missteps can be the very things that guide us into where we're meant to be. Often we call it guilt, but really it's grief. And I think that's where we really have to extend a lot of compassion to ourselves. And I've had to become an expert in that, Julia, because every week, every guest that I have on, I basically learn something else that I didn't do that would have been really helpful. So I've had to learn about that and grieve throughout.
So when you say grieve, you mean grieve for the mistakes that you've made, or
things that I didn't know, things that I didn't know then, when my babies were babies, that I now know. I've had to, in a way, grieve, let go of how it was, accept I knew what I knew. I was doing the best I could. But what's so beautiful about what you said is that I think that my children have always felt that love, and I always felt that from my parents. And I think at the end of the day, when all is said and done, I hope they feel loved. And there's some exercises in the book where I invite people to think about life in that perspective. I invite them to zoom forward to when they're 80, to look back and think, what do I want my children to say about their childhood? What are the values that I want to really live now, that I want them to look back on and say? Because I think if we're not intentional about those things, sometimes life just, not sometimes, all the time, life just gets so busy and full.
But also there's that thing of, I think you said this about your mum in a kind of roundabout way, which is that all I want is for you to be happy, but didn't model being happy. And so it's hard for a child to really know how to be happy when it's not modeled for them.
Yeah.
And this isn't to add a load of guilt to parenting, like, oh my God, I got to be happy as well. But it's more about recognizing that we can be as imperfect as we are and also have joy. and allow for our missteps and do the 30%, as it were. Because when we are constantly criticizing ourselves and turning against ourselves, the little window of joy is so narrow that it would need a rocket launcher to kind of come through and allow the love to come through. And so we have to kind of let ourselves allow these things to flow in and flow out. And then we can enjoy the small things like seeing a daisy or laughing at the idiot things your children have said, which is so wonderful.
I know. And I think, parents feel so guilty about doing things for themselves. And I always remind them exactly what you just said, that actually, when we do things for ourselves, it does enable us to bring a different energy into our homes. Yeah. And that's what children do not hear what we're telling them often. They pick up on it, that they're far more intuitive and feeling than we are, because they haven't started that neck up living yet that so many of us live in. So
that your body's in an Uber and your head's in a computer.
100%. They're so tuned into the feeling of the home and the feeling of their parents. And so that's one thing we can really let go of. And that's what's really shifted for me, actually, is I used to do a lot of things for myself, and I really used to focus on my own healing, but I would always feel a little bit guilty about it. Whereas now I don't. I really don't, because
that's
I think
so good.
Yeah, it is good, because there's a freedom in it, and it just means, actually, no, I want to focus on my girls seeing a mother who is genuinely, happy and serene sometimes, and is kind to herself, hoping that even a little bit of that will get absorbed into
and that you're more likely to have fun, right?
Yeah.
And so linking the fun and the play is linking to one's inner child. So you talked about going ahead to the 80-year-old you and looking at your children, what values you would wish for them, because obviously you can't control it, but also how the child in you influences the parent in you. And when your child kicks off, the parent goes out the window. But also there's the playful child in you who, you really want to let her come out and play and splash and be silly and dance.
I didn't have a sense of how much my own children would reignite some of my own inner child, which is just things that happened to us when we were younger, including beliefs and programming that we have. And I remember my little girl, she would have been 5 and she'd just started at school. And I said, "Did you have fun at playtime today?" And she said, "Oh yeah, it was fine. I sat on the bench on my own." And I burst into tears. I mean, the reaction was big, and we talk about in the book, if it's a big reaction, like if it's hysterical, it tends to be historical. Like a big reaction is often not about what's going on in front of you. And I managed to pull it together, and she was perfectly happy. She was actually, what she was doing was I think regulating herself. She gets very overstimulated in the playground, and I've taught her to take moments out when it feels too much in her body. Like, I've taught her that. But what I realized was happening was that I'd had those same childhood playground experiences, but they hadn't been positive for me. I had been left out. I hadn't had anyone to play with. And I think I just wish more parents knew how normal that is to happen. Because I didn't, and I think so many parents tell me, like, I'm having these huge reactions and I'm being really triggered with my child, and I'm a terrible parent. Why am I, why can I? And
why am I the child?
Exactly. And then there's all these parenting books telling you you've got to be the steady ship and how easy it is to do that. And I really want to offer a voice which says it's actually really difficult when you are being activated. And Philippa Perry talks a lot about this, and she's in the book talking about how it's actually the same age that you are. So maybe if my child had been 9 telling me that playground story, it wouldn't have had the same impact, but it was because I was the same age. But my sort of take on it is that it actually can be a really positive thing, because I get to give.
You in touch.
That's right. And I get to give, like, I love it. I sometimes talk about having 3 children, which is super kind of cheesy, because I'm also got my own little girl with me. But as I go through this parenting journey, I'm able to give her some of the things that she didn't have or needed or wanted. And as I give them to myself, I give them to my girls. So it's never too late to do that. And I think what's also really important in this conversation, and I open the chapter that I talk about all of this, is not to also forget to claim all the strengths and also all the incredible things, because I think each of us get incredible things from our parents that we absolutely want to pass on. And I really invite people to think about what those are and get really intentional about making sure that we do pass those things on.
Include the good. Yeah.
Include the good,
Yeah.
because there's so much good. And if you're listening to this, and there's incredible, qualities that you have that no doubt your parents instilled in you. And then I think looking at the harder side, which is, okay, what are some of the things that I needed?
That I
And,
want to discard now.
exactly. Like if you needed emotional validation and you didn't get that, give that to yourself now. Stop telling yourself that you're silly for feeling sad or that you shouldn't be feeling this, because then you're repeating that same pattern within yourself. So, if you needed that emotional validation, give it to yourself now. Like, be your own parent now, and then parent your children from that place, because I just think that's so empowering, and it's actually really beautiful. And it's not about blaming previous generations. Emotions just weren't a thing. We didn't have the education or the understanding.
No.
That's why it's so important to, think about all these things with compassion.
Context of what they knew and who they were at their
Exactly.
time.
So many people will say
parents.
to me, that's right. So many people say to me, how do I tell my mum that, she did a terrible job emotionally validating me? And I'll think, are you sure? Why? Well, why not just focus on
reparenting yourself
and parenting your children from a different place?
I know a lot of people kind of have a sense of woo-woo about the inner child. And I do get that, because I have a slight feeling of it myself. But I also think it's a way of accessing ourselves for our own therapy, but also in all our relationships, because you can have sibling rivalry with your husband. You can have sibling rivalry with your kids. I remember Natasha beating me at chess and me literally tipping up the board, which was an exact reenactment of what happened in my childhood with my sibs doing it to me. And I just acted it out. And I didn't apologize because I was too cross. Another perfect moment of my parenting. But if I can access, so one of the things that I encourage people to do, which again may sound more woo-woo, is to get photographs of you as a child. Happy photographs. I have quite a lot of photographs of me crying. I don't know why they were taken, but they're very useful. But all of them, ones where you're feisty, where you're laughing, where you're kind of dressed up, and your family together, and then put them in a kind of collage. And that's a really good way of accessing you as a child, because you can go back to you then, and then you can have this dialogue, like what she's saying to you, and then you listen as the adult you, and then you talk back. And then when you have that dialogue, that's when you can really support the child, but also you can take the child out of the traumatic situation, so you can pick them up and take them to your calm place or your safe place. And that's incredibly powerful.
Yeah, it's so beautiful, because, and I get what you mean. It does sound a bit weird, inner child, doesn't it? 'Cause it's like, what, there's a little child living in me, but really just the idea that at any stage, that's
your
right.
Past always influences your present, right? So
Exactly,
however you frame it.
That's right. That at any stage we can choose to heal some of what happened in that past to feel differently in the present. For me, I think, thank God that's an option, because if it wasn't, I definitely wouldn't be sat here. So I don't think we need to hold that idea so heavily as sometimes we do. It isn't about hours of That's right. It's not about hours of regressive therapy and going back into traumas. None of that. For me, some people teach. That's not how I teach. I'm a coach, not a therapist. So coaching tends to be focused on moving forwards. So I think it's about, okay, where am I? Where do I continually feel tripped up? And could this have something to do? It might not have anything to do with your past, but could it? And if it does, what could I give myself now that might help me feel more of how I want to feel in the present?
And that's those MotherKind moments, aren't they, where you ask yourself questions, and they're all through the book. They're really useful. And the MotherKind musings. The thing that links this for me is working mothers, modern working mothers, and how we manage that, and how we manage it with other mothers, the other mothers that work, the other mothers that don't work, and also our inner critic, and how we manage the guilt. I don't know where you've got to with all of that. I have quite strong views, by the way, so I'll tell you mine after.
I mean, it's a huge topic, isn't it?
More mothers work now than ever before. 50% of the population
more mothers work
are working
than ever.
Women.
Exactly. And I think that one of the things that has happened, which is making this moment in time so challenging, is that, as you say, Julia, more mothers are working than at any other point in history. But what I see time and time again, and I talk to you quite a lot in the book, is that the systems at home haven't necessarily caught up. And I think that's why we get these working mother burnout statistics that we do, because often what people in my community tell me is that they're working full-time or part-time jobs and also being responsible for the full, not only the mental load, so the planning and the thinking, but also the doing of the cooking and the bedtimes and the lifts and the clubs and the schools and the clothes. I mean, it's actually crazy. And there's lots of research that show that the hours that mothers work, paid and unpaid, is 98 hours a week, which is equivalent to 2.5 full-time jobs. So it's actually an impossible task. So I think the first thing to look at, if you have a partner when you're in a relationship, is to look there. How could we make this a more equitable distribution? And that doesn't mean 50-50. It is already 50-50, in fact, because everyone's situations and working hours and patterns are so different. But how could we make this more fair? And then I think the second thing is that guilt model that you and I were talking about. You are not doing anything wrong by working. In fact, you are doing so much right. And there are incredible studies that show the impact on children of having a working mother. It's not, you are not doing anything wrong. So it's not guilt. Remember, guilt's when you're doing something wrong that goes against your values. One of my core values is my work, is being of service in the world, is being creative, is stretching myself. And that's where
I'm bringing home the bacon. And
Exactly. I want to show my girls independence. I've always been like that. I've never been someone who's wanted to rely financially or really in any way on anyone. And there's probably some more therapy that I need to have about that. But that's a value of mine that I feel proud that I'm showing my girls. So I think really just taking that guilt away, because you are not doing anything wrong, is important. And also adjusting your standards based on your capacities. So if you are a working mother or parent, you're not going to have a spotless home at the same time, unless you have an awful lot of help, in which case you've got a lot of privilege and you probably aren't facing some of the same challenges necessarily. Yeah. So I think lowering those standards based on your capacity, and don't compare yourself to a working mother who has 2 sets of involved grandparents around the corner. When we left London and we moved to be by the sea, and so many people moved here to be close to their families. We weren't that smart. We moved further away from our families. And I realized I was comparing myself to a lot of these mothers at the school gates who had 4 available, trustworthy, reliable grandparents who could help. And I thought, I've got to stop this, because it's just my husband and I. We have just different capacity, different capabilities. We've got different resources. So I think that's really important as well. Tell me what you think.
Well, some of it, and so that is what you're also talking about, is facing the reality. Like, don't live in la la land of what you think a working mother is like and what it can do.
You cannot be a working mum and also do every pickup, be at everything, float around in a floral dress, cooking every meal and making sensory boxes.
So because I have always been a working mother and I worked all through all 4 of my children's childhood, I believe very strongly that it's good for mothers to work. I did feel guilty. I do feel guilty, but I have never felt that guilty because I needed it. I knew that. And of course, some people's jobs, I've been lucky. I found a job that I absolutely love that has kind of given me a lot of meaning. And, lots of people's jobs are not as satisfying as mine. So I think obviously I acknowledge that. But life is long, and parenting in relative terms now is quite short. And if you step out of your job now, if you do no work between now and when your children, say, go to university, the chances of you getting reemployed are really low. So also the thing that at the level of your professional life that you step out, the higher you are up the ladder, the more likely it is that you can go back to that ladder. If you leave very low up the ladder, then it's harder to get back in. But the tension in that is you tend to be older if you're higher up the ladder, and so your fertility is diminished. So this is an incredibly sort of complex juggle.
It's very complex, yeah.
But my basic fundamental belief is that keep your foot in the door of work. Even if it's doing a job that you don't like, it is not your ideal job. And even if it's only for a day or 2 days a week, because it keeps your confidence and the belief and the identity. I'm someone who can work. I can do a job, even if it isn't a job that you really like. Because going back and having to retrain, having had no experience for 20 years, it's incredibly difficult
and
to get a decent job.
And this is where we need the childcare reform, because
Yeah.
sadly, if you are working in a job where it's not a highly paid job, by any stretch, you will not be able to cover potentially the nursery fees, particularly before children go to school. So the nursery fees are, the statistics falling out of my head, but much higher than the average salary. Cost-wise. So this is the problem. There are so many mothers, Julia, who want to do exactly what you're talking to. They want to keep their foot in the door, but the maths just does not add up for them to do that, which is why some of the reforms that we're seeing coming through now, where we've got 3 hours for 2-year-olds, is absolutely game-changing, because it means that mothers can do exactly what you're talking to. Tell me, when your children, it's fascinating to me that you have clearly inspired your children, because 2 of them do the same job.
They very legitimately say it's nothing to do with me. They do. They are in slightly. Sophie, Emily is a child psychotherapist, and Sophie has worked in very different fields to me. But all my children work, and they all work hard. My husband works hard. So whether we role modelled working hard, and also I think that there would be criticism for us about the way we work. So I don't think we're any role model for anybody. But for women, I think if you can, for confidence and to have a different version of yourself that isn't just being a parent, which, let's face it, can be really repetitive and really boring at times. But you can go out and have a different experience, that a new version of you comes back through the door and has more energy, even if it's quite a boring job, but you're really pleased to see your children, which I think it's hard to keep up. Maybe some people can, but there was no way I could have kept up my interest in them, my attention to them, my capacity to be with them, if I hadn't done something else that was also interesting.
Yeah, it's interesting. I'm the same. I don't know if it's a personality type. For me, I've always been ambitious. I've always been curious. I've always been interested. And I bring those qualities into my parenting 100%.
Yeah.
But like you, I also have needed something outside of that. And when we look at the way that children used to be raised, children and our brains actually, and our bodies, and we know this from some incredible work, particularly that's going on at the moment, are designed to be raised in community. There's a phrase called allo parent. Do you know that phrase? Yeah. I just love reading about allo parents, because what it shows is that children who have multiple caregivers actually thrive. And
it's a village thing.
That's right. And there's a piece of research that came out a couple of months ago that showed that the average mother would have 8 people around her supporting her with those children. So I think the village looks different today. It might look like your key worker at nursery. It might look like a nanny if you're able to afford that, or a childminder, or a school teacher. But I think this idea that we have to be everything to our children as one parent, or even 2, is too much, and it feels too much, because it's not meant to be that way. We are meant to raise our children in community. And I know when my mum comes to stay, I always cry when she leaves, because I think that's how it's meant to feel. Yeah. And there's just 3 of us in the house, but it feels like night and day. And that was how it used to be the norm, is that you would have aunties and sisters, and you'd just be passing the baby, passing the children.
But it was never ideal either, because they were, bad-tempered old cows of aunts and things. So it's not like there's this picture.
100%. Let's not make it feel blissful. But I think it's important to remember that if you feel guilty that you can't be everything, or you find it boring or overwhelming, it's because you can't. And it was never designed to be that way. And yes, the allo parents look different now. It might not be your sister or your mum or your auntie or whoever it is. It might be a key worker at nursery, but that's okay.
And that you can kind of really work at creating that with intention.
Absolutely.
So we're coming to the end, lovely Zoe. Is there a kind of final thought, that a thread that runs through the book that you want someone listening to hear now, but also to encourage them to go to the book?
I think there's many. The first one is, if you're finding it hard, there's nothing wrong with you. It is really hard. And you're not failing. That is, like you said, Julia, like the reality is it's really hard. It's also incredible. Yeah. Where we don't have to be binary. Like, it's hard and it's amazing. And I think what I've really tried to do with the book is, we're in completely different times now. And I've really tried to give new tools for new times. So new tools to navigate guilt.
They're well evidenced, well researched.
Completely well evidenced. Yeah. I spent way too long researching, to be honest, this book.
That's great.
And about, exactly that. And, the reference section section at the back is long. There are a lot of, this isn't things that I've just anecdotally stumbled upon. These are all evidence-based from real experts, like Gabor Mate and yourself and Dr. Becky, who's an amazing parenting expert. It's not just me and my clients in there. So yeah, I've really tried to give, like, if you are struggling with your energy or your guilt or your feelings, or, being continually triggered by your children or your past coming up, that is all in the book.
Circuit breakers.
Exactly. I like to think that anything that a parent or a mother is struggling with, they could find something. They will find a tool in that book that would help them in that moment. And that's what makes me feel emotional, because I think that's what we so need.
And so is there a compassionate blessing you can give yourself as the book, here it is, this wonderful book, comes out in the world? What would you say to yourself if you were talking from that position for you?
For me, I think I think the way that I've written the book is that, as someone who can struggle with low confidence and to think, who am I? Something that really helped me is to think that this is my offering to the world. It's not actually about me. It's not about whether I feel confident enough to do some of the things that I'm invited to. It's that actually, for some reason, I have been given this absolute passion and interest and curiosity and set of skills that has enabled me to put it out in the world. And I think when I enable myself to step aside and to remind myself that it's not about me, that really helps me overcome, some of the insecurity and the nervousness and the lack of confidence, because this is all new to me. Like, I never wanted to be a public face or any of that. So I think that's really honest and vulnerable and truthful. That is what I say to myself often. This isn't about me. This is about something bigger than me. And I just happen to be the messenger for right now.
And I think the piece that you can add is to really let yourself enjoy it. Like, turn off that critical voice or the picture of what you kind of want. And I know you say that in the same way in your book about parenting, but I think it's true in relationship to your book, is to embrace it however it emerges and is out in the world. And it's an enormous thing to publish a book. It is like having another baby in a way. And you won't know how much it will touch people who you never hear from. It may change their lives, and hopefully we'll hear from them. But just let it go out in the world and let it do its thing without gripping too tight on what your expectations are. Let it be its own messenger.
That's beautiful. Thank you. Someone did say that to me, actually. They said you give birth to the book and then you let it go.
Yeah. Roots and wings. So thank you, Zoe, and I wish you the best with it. And it's a wonderful book. I highly recommend it.
Oh, thank you, Julia. Thank you for all your support over the years as well.